Well, Njeka, firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that we're organising this event from the unceded lands of the Kulin Nations. Doug, who's our coordinator, is on Wavarong land. Peter is on Boonwurrung, and Andrew, Chris, Rick, and myself are all on Wurundjeri lands. They've cared for and managed these lands for many tens of thousands of years in a sustainable and responsible manner. And we've much to learn from them on their methods and procedures, and also about their governance methods. I offer my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and to elders from other mobs who may be attending us with us tonight, and to all their peoples. I'd then like to welcome all of you, and I think we have people from not only local, but from quite far away tonight. Hi, I'm Rob Gardner, and I help to organise these meetings with Chris, Rick, and Peter. And Doug is in the background doing all the hard work. As this is a webinar, and you've probably all been on Renew webinars before, very briefly, Renew has two magazines, Sanctuary and Renew. We have a research organisation. We do a lot of lobbying. We organise the Sustainable House Day, Speed Date and Expert, and the electric vehicle exhibitions. So tonight I am very pleased and honoured to introduce Andrew Redaway, who has considerable experience and a vast knowledge of the grid and associated aspects of sustainability. He worked for AMO and developed their domestic solar modelling system. And in Renew, he's well known for developing the Sunlighter model, which is excellent too. I could go on for quite a while, but I think we want to get into it. So I'll pass you now over to Andrew.
All right, thanks, Robin. Hope everyone can hear all right. I'll just share the screen. All right, hopefully everyone can see that okay. So what I was hoping to go through was firstly talking about what are the options for developing the grid, and which of them are the cheapest, most economic. As part of that, I'll do a brief side track to talk about Snowy Hydro 2.0 as one of the biggest energy storage projects that's out there at the moment, and then get into the main point of the presentation, which is about the electricity market. So the economic structures that are outdated and are actually going to be delaying our transition to renewables. And lastly, talk a bit about solutions to that. Oh, this picture that I've got here of the wind turbine, the technician there is actually a former worker in a coal mine. So that's a nice little story behind that one. It's from Canada. I think Rob already mentioned what we do at Renew, so feel free to have a look at our website. All right, so what are some of the things that might be causing delays in the electricity grid and its transition to renewables? Well, the first one that might come to mind is economic. So just is it that renewables are not as economic as fossil fuels? And that's may have been true quite a while back, but hasn't been for many years. And I'll be explaining that. So that's not a real reason to cause delays. Politics certainly is a factor, but I'm not going into political issues in the in this talk. Poor planning can be an issue, and that is tied into the politics as well. But market structures is probably one of the looming issues that I'm going to be focusing on. Okay, so there's a bunch of resources, presentations and webinars, that a recent webinar by Professor Ken Baldwin. So I'd recommend having a look at some of these as well as tonight's webinar, and I'll be avoiding rehashing material that we've covered recently. So if you're thinking, oh, why didn't Andrew talk about this aspect of the transition, then it's probably because we've covered it fairly recently. And feel free to ask the questions, but if that's the case, then I might refer to one of these previous resources. All right, so the national electricity market, the term really has two meanings. One meaning is the economic structure, the method for buying and selling electricity on the wholesale market. But the other meaning of the term NEM is the physical power system that's encompassed by that market. And as you can see on the map there, it's pretty long. And this is just showing the transmission lines. Branching out from the transmission is the distribution system, which you're familiar with, the poles and wires down the street. So that extends to basically every town, and most of the farms, most of the properties are connected to that distribution system. So it extends a lot further. Now, just a note on the cost of those. So the transmission system is not that expensive. In terms of a residential electricity bill, it might account for about 7 or 8% of the bill. It varies depending on where you are and what distribution system you're part of. The distribution network is a lot more expensive. There you're looking at costing about 40% of the bill. So even though the poles and wires are a lot smaller than the big transmission towers out in the countryside, there's just so many more of them that they are expensive in that distribution network. Oh, and the other point here is that the power system acts as a sort of a single entity. It's connected, and what happens in Queensland in terms of say a power station turning off or a power line getting blown over by the wind, that sort of thing, it can cause ripple effects that go all the way down around the whole system. So yeah, it's quite a complicated beast. Right, so one of the points is that we're in a situation now where the old coal-fired power stations are wearing out. The power stations, generators, I'll use those terms pretty interchangeably. And they have to be replaced by something. If we want to keep the lights on, we have to make up for that generation that's exiting the market and exiting the physical system. So whatever way we go, there's going to be a lot of investment that's required. So you might look at that as a burden. You know, it's a big cost that the nation has to bear. But on the other hand, you could look at it as an opportunity when we've got lots of organisations considering ways to kickstart the economy and keep it going well as we hopefully come out of the COVID situation. What better to invest in than a productive investments that also help to clean up our power supply. So how did we get here? Why are we in this situation where we've got a big amount of investment that we need to put in? Well, it goes back to, you can see on my timeline here, I've got going back to 1970, but it even goes back a bit before that. So around the middle of the last century, basically everything had the electricity grids in the different states had been consolidated into state-based electricity commissions. I've got a few logos up there. So ELCOM in New South Wales, SECV, Victoria, ETSA, South Australia, the South East Queensland Electricity Board. So these were government commissions. So they had a monopoly on the integrated electricity system in each state. And they ran the power system and the electricity grid as with an engineering sort of viewpoint, taking a long-term planning view, planning ahead and building things to keep the costs low and hopefully, and keep the reliability at the levels where it was wanted to be. And they, from the 70s to the 90s, and a bit earlier, they built a lot of coal-fired power stations. So just some examples in the pictures there. So by the mid-1990s, we had a pretty comprehensive fleet of coal-fired power stations, a bit of an oversupply of capacity, in fact. That's one of the things that these state-based electricity commissions were criticised for, was maybe going a bit overboard on the reliability issue and building a bit more than necessary in these decades. So then in the mid-1990s, we had a big change where the national electricity market was brought in. And so that was privatisation of the old electricity commissions, splitting them up, so no longer vertically integrated. We had separate entities for electricity retailers that you're familiar with, sending you the bills. Generators were separate, and the transmission and distribution companies were all nominally at least separate. And you could have ownership between them, but yeah. So that was a big change. And after that, it was private companies running the system under regulation by a few different market entities, and they haven't embarked on a big construction blitz like what happened previously, because they didn't need to. So for quite a while there, that they were just working off mostly working off the generators that they'd inherited from the previous regime. And more recently, we've seen some wind and solar construction, but not to the level that we had back in the State Electricity Commission days. All right, so we need to build something. So what are our options? So here I'm showing these, the green arrow at the top is outlining the renewable option, and the browny grey one at the bottom is the fossil fuel option. So if we went renewables, then renewables are capital intensive. So they cost relatively a large amount to build up front, but then after you build it, they're very cheap to run because you don't have fuel costs. Obviously, if you're running a coal-fired power station, then you have to pay for mining that coal and digging it out of the ground. Emissions are very low, of course, and they need firming. So when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, as we always hear, you need to cover that. So you can do that through energy storage, and also through transmission to share that renewable resource from around the grid, from parts that happen to be in a high windy or sunny to areas of the grid that are not. If we went the fossil fuel route, then the upfront cost is relatively cheaper, but when you build a plant like this, you're going to run it for 30, 40, 50 years. And over that time, those fuel costs do add up. So it ends up being quite expensive. It's also relatively a lot more expensive to build one of these now than what it was back in the 1970s or 80s. There's new standards. It is more expensive to build things now than it used to be. And of course, you'll have the higher emissions and also local health impacts from the smoke and all the nasty stuff that comes out with that. Now, in terms of which one would be tricky or not, the renewable option is a bit tricky because you're moving to quite a different system. So your generators are going to be located in different spots, not close to the coal mines, but in areas of the grid where it's sunny and windy. the fossil fuel option would be a relatively simple transition because you're just building something that's fairly similar to what you had before. Of course, it may not be simple for other reasons, but yeah, in engineering terms, it would be a more simple option. All right, so if we look at those two possibilities, which one would be the most economic? And the answer is the renewable option is more economic. So you pay a bit more up front, you invest more up front, but when you consider it over that half-century lifespan, then, or half-century horizon, then yeah, it works out being more economic overall. And the source of information for that, the best one is the draft Integrated System Plan, ISP, that was published fairly recently by the Australian Energy Market Operator, AEMO. So their study is based on a long-term engineering analysis. So they're estimating the cost to build these plants using research in conjunction with the CSIRO, etc. And the cost to run it, the cost to the labour costs, how much it's going to generate. They do detailed simulation studies hourly for decades into the future under different climate scenarios. And so out of all that detailed work, they produce a simulation model that automatically chooses what's the least cost option for the grid. And consistently it comes out with renewables is the cheapest option to replace the old coal-fired power stations. And that's cheaper even though there's no cost built in for the CO2 emissions impacts or the local health impact. So if you were to build in those costs, then it would be well ahead of the fossil fuel option. And there's been a bunch of other studies done by universities and they've found the same thing. AEMO, the scenarios they looked at only went up to a maximum of 90% renewables. And so the rest of it was basically gas-fired generation. So I'll come back to that as well. All right, so what does that look like? So their most renewable scenario got up to 90% renewables. So on this map that I've got on the right, it's so the green is the wind, the yellow is the solar. The size of those circles is not the geographic footprint, but it's just indicating the relative rated capacities of the wind and solar in those areas. So you can see that they're projecting a large amount in northern New South Wales, northeast New South Wales, southeast Queensland. Relatively a lot down in Tassie for the size of the population down there, and also relatively a lot in South Australia. Victoria's got a fair bit, but it's, according to the least cost simulations, with this solution, Victoria would be supplied from other states fairly regularly. So you're looking at 30 gigawatts of solar in terms of the capacity. Now, just to give you an idea, a coal-fired power station such as Liddell, which has been in the news a fair bit for over the last few years, that's got a rated capacity of 2 gigawatts. So we're looking at 30 gigawatts of wind, 30 gigawatts of solar, 35 gigawatts of rooftop solar, so that's even a bit bigger, 20 gigawatts of energy storage. So that's a rated power capacity. So energy storage that could discharge at a power level of 20 gigawatts. The amount of energy that you would need to be able to store in the energy storages would be around 530 gigawatt hours of energy. So that's enough energy to supply around 23 hours of average demand for electricity through the NEM. So that's the level that AEMO has worked out through their simulations that you'd need to support a 90% renewable grid. so that's what we need to build in terms of renewables. We also have existing renewables like the traditional hydroelectric generators mostly in the snowy scheme in the snowy mountains, and also Tasmania has a fair bit of hydroelectric. Their system's mostly hydroelectric. So that would be part of the mix as well, which is quite useful when you have a extended week of, say, cloudy, still conditions. Then that's when you'd be working those traditional hydroelectric as much as you can to support the system. And you've also got some sugarcane bagasse, for example, bioenergy that would play a part as well. All right, so if that's an example of where we want to head, then how are we comparing against it? So wind, 30 gigawatts of capacity as a sort of target, as a nominal number to compare against. At the moment, we've got 2.4 gigawatts in the grid. That's based off AEMO's registration list, generator registration as of a week ago or so. So we're only about 8% of the way there. And annually, that's growing at a rate of about 1.1 gigawatts per year. And that's based off data from the Australian Energy Regulator for 2018 and the first 9 months of 2019. And I've brought that back to an annualized figure. Now, when you're looking at an annual rate, you'll get different stats depending on what time period you choose and what definition you use, but it's somewhere around that level. If we move to the solar farms, if we want to get to 30 gigawatts, at the moment we're 3.3, so we're 11% of the way there, and we're building them a bit faster or have been recently at 1.8 gigawatts per year. Rooftop solars are a relative star at the moment, so we've already got 10 gigawatts of that on households and businesses. So this is solar that's behind the meter, offsetting people's consumption rather than being out in a big solar farm just exporting into the grid. So that's about, we're up to almost 30% of the 35 gigawatts that AEMO had in their 90% scenario. And that's also being built faster, around 2.1 gigawatts per year. So if you add it all up, we're almost 20% of the way to that fully renewable grid. But we still got a long way to go. 77 gigawatts is not a small amount. And if we keep going at the recent rate, then it would take 15 years to get there. And many people, including Renew, would argue that that's not fast enough. When you take into account the imperative to decarbonise and get our emissions down to hopefully keep global warming at a level that's not too catastrophic. So all of the top part of this slide has just been about the energy generation, electricity generation. The other requirement is energy storage and transmission. And unfortunately, there hasn't been anything significant built for energy storage or transmission. Now, I know there'll be a lot of people thinking, but what about the Tesla big battery in South Australia, the Hornsdale Power Reserve? Yeah, it's not really at the scale that you need for firming the wind and solar at these gigawatt levels. I'll come back to that. Okay, so in recent months, there's been a lot of bad press. There's been a lot of developments coming out with solar and wind developers and investors having trouble. And that's quite concerning. At a time when we want to be accelerating, it looks like we're hitting some significant headwinds. We've got investors suffering unexpected reductions in their generation. And the immediate reason for that is inadequacies in the transmission system. So I've got a map of Victoria here, Western Victoria, as an example. The coal-fired power stations for Victoria are in the east of the state. The sunny, windy areas are in the west, and the transmission lines are not particularly strong in that region. And it's hard to get new transmission lines approved. So what's been happening is you've got lots of developments of solar and wind farms around this area, and they're being told by the transmission owners or the market operator that, oh, sorry, you can't start generating yet because you're going to cause problems. There are these technical issues with the grid, and if you start generating, then it's going to lead to instability in the grid. So we have delays, and we also have downgrades in the amount of revenue that investors are getting per megawatt hour of energy they generate, which is not good and quite unexpected in a lot of cases. These issues have led to this region being called the Rhombus of Regret. So the rhombus refers to the geometric shape of these transmission lines. So transmission is an issue, and the process to get a new transmission line built is quite stuck in red tape. It's a process that was really designed more for an incremental, slow enhancement of an existing transmission system in order to meet, for example, increases in electricity demand. It's not a process that was ever intended for a whole-scale transformation of an electricity grid. But when you look at it, if we did have a proactive process, these transmission lines should have been built in anticipation of the generation that was coming, because we have had, it's not really relevant anymore because it's pretty much run its course, but we have had a renewable energy target to incentivize wind farms and solar farms being built, and that's been in place for a long time, the people planning the grid, in an ideal world, they would have anticipated that, well, yes, if we're going to build these wind and solar farms, then they're going to be built where it's windy and sunny. So that transmission capacity could have been put in ahead of time, but it wasn't. So transmission is one of the big issues that's delaying the transition to renewables. And yeah, and the real reason for those delays is the slow, difficult process, the regulatory process. So that can be considered part of the energy market. All right, I've thrown in just a couple of these little cartoons to break up the presentation a little bit. I know it can be a bit dry talking about transmission lines and things, and I thought these were quite topical for our current situation where everyone's working from home and doing meetings from home, etc. And it's also got something else that's relevant or sort of topical for this presentation, and I'll leave you to think about that for a while and see if you can work out what it is. Okay, so let's talk about the market in terms of its regulatory and economic structural basis. So yeah, as I mentioned, mid-1990s, the national electricity market was created, and we had a big transition from state-based monopolies to generators competing in a competitive market. So state-based monopolies, yeah, I've already mentioned they took an engineering approach, and part of that was if they were going to build a new power station to take over from an old one, that they would be able to plan it and have an overlap. So if there were any teething problems with the new power station, then the old one was still there in service to cover it. Then they'd mothball the old power station, and again, it could still be brought back if necessary. There's no such concept in the new market. In fact, you can't really have that sort of cooperation between different companies. Under a market system based on competition, that would be called collusion. So companies have an incentive to actually hide their, conceal their plans from each other. So on a short-term basis, energy is bought and sold a bit like a stock market, so on a half-hourly basis. So it's the wholesale market or the spot market for electricity. Anything that's going to happen depends on individual companies' decisions. Yes, there are, it's influenced by government policies, etc., but most of it is down to companies. And the concept behind a market like this is, there's the term that was originally brought up by Adam Smith a couple of hundred years ago, but the invisible hand. So the idea is that companies or people acting in their own self-interest, when you add all that up together, it's going to result in a good economical optimal outcome. All right, so one thing to keep in mind is that a market such as this is just an economic structure, and it's a means to an end. You don't have a market for the sake of having a market. You put it in place to hopefully meet the needs of society and consumers. So with electricity, you basically want reliable electricity that's affordable and hopefully clean as well. So let's think about some other sections of the economy and society where we have markets or not. So I've got a little bit of a sort of seesaw down here. So on the left, we've got areas that are not expected to compete with each other, like water supply and firefighting. Water supply, you can consider that a little bit like electricity, actually, both sort of utilities. And on the right, you've got clearly sort of competitive areas such as stock market, general business, politics. Electricity generation is sort of in the middle. Electricity distribution is not competitive. In your local area of your house, you only have one company that has a monopoly on those poles and wires. You don't have multiple poles and wires from different companies going down your street, luckily. All right, so is the current market resilient? Yeah, I have put quite a few graphics in this. I hope it hasn't gone too far, but I got some feedback from my wife when I showed her some of my slides that they were too wordy and too hard to follow. So hopefully the graphics make it a bit easier to illustrate some of the points. So let's think about the nature of competition. Is it a good thing or not? And in what situations is it a good thing or a useful thing? So if you think about sailing ships sailing across the Atlantic for trading purposes, if you do want multiple ships to compete with each other or shipping companies, because that clearly is in the interest of consumers. If a ship can work out a faster, cheaper way to get the goods across, then that's great. But on a single ship, competition is a bit more problematic. You don't necessarily want the crew members all with their own ideas about what to do and which way to go. Yeah, that might work when you've got plain sailing, but when you've got a storm, then I would argue that on a ship you really need a captain who can just give give firm directions, a clear set of instructions, and just have it done rapidly. So in terms of our current electricity market, I would argue that it behaves more like a single ship rather than multiple ships all competing with each other. And because the grid does act as a single machine, a single entity, and all the parts have to work together, all the different generators and transmission lines and everything else, it's more like a single ship. So since the NEM was created, for the first couple of decades, it inherited this big fleet of existing generators that were mature and bedded in. So it was pretty easy for any system to run that power system for the first couple of decades. But now it's a bit different. As I mentioned, the old coal-fired power stations wearing out, and there's new technologies coming in. There's lots of changes that are coming into the power system. So this is more like stormy weather. So it would be interesting to think about if wind and solar had never been invented, and we were just looking at building new coal-fired and gas-fired power stations, then how would the current market have handled that? It's hard to see how it would have handled even a simple sort of like-for-like refresh very well, because you get companies closing down their coal-fired power station, and then another one has to build one, and there's no smooth way to coordinate that process in the market. We saw with Hazelwood Power Station in Victoria, that shut down with only 5 months notice that they gave everybody, caused some issues, and since then there's been a rule change put in that says, okay, generators, if you're going to shut down, you need to give 3 years notice. But even that, it's not really a neat solution, because if a power station's become uneconomic, do you really want to burden the investors, the owners, with 3 years of losses? And alternatively, if you've got a power station that catastrophically breaks down, then it's out of action, no matter what the rules say. So yeah, it's hard to see how the current market would have handled even that. So in our current system, we need lots of investment, but it's up to individual companies to decide whether to invest or not. What if they don't invest? So let's say investors are not confident of making profits from wind and solar and transmission and batteries, all energy storage, all those things that we need. Well, then we have a bit of paralysis. So if we think forward to what might happen in that situation, if we're not building new stuff, if we've got coal-fired power stations closing, then we're looking at electricity shortages, blackouts. So once that becomes critical, then I would expect the governments would intervene. They'd say, okay, coal-fired power stations are closing, we don't have something to replace them, we just need to build something, no matter what, as quick as possible. So my guess is that you'd have a knee-jerk reaction to build fossil fuels, because it's, from an engineering point of view, it's the simple option. Just replace it like for like. And obviously, as we saw, that would be a bad outcome, because in the long term, it's more expensive for consumers. And of course, there's the other problems with fossil fuels. So what's likely to stop investors from investing and building new wind, solar and energy storage? Well, I've already mentioned the problems with transmission, so that's one. Let's talk about energy storage. So in the current electricity market, it's mostly an energy only market. So you make money by generating electricity and putting it into the market. You get paid for your generation from the electricity retailers. Storing energy is not generating energy. It's just storing it. So you're charging up your facility, storing some energy. So you're buying it and then you're selling it later. And you can't really make a lot of money in the present market doing that. So investors are not jumping into it. But that undervalues the importance and the value of energy storage in the current system. So energy storage, you need it to firm wind and solar, right? So if you look at the whole package, you need wind and solar and energy storage, as I've got in this little muffin picture down here. So the wind and solar is the more yummy muffin top, and energy storage is the stem at the bottom, which is still yummy, I guess, but not as appetizing maybe. So the market is failing to deliver on the whole package, and the reason is because companies and investors, they're not responsible for the reliability of the system as a whole. Their imperative is basically to make a profit. So why would they invest and spend money on the less profitable part when they can just focus and cherry pick on the part which does make money, is more obviously profitable, which is the wind and solar. So an analogy, I guess, would be developers of new housing suburbs on the outskirts of our cities. They're building lots of houses, but they're not building train stations, for example. Well, in many cases they're not, and that's not their responsibility. So why would they do it? It's a similar sort of thing here, I guess. Even though from a society point of view, a consumer point of view, they'd be better off by having that. All right, and if you don't have storage, then you get problems with profitability on your wind farms and your solar farms. So if you're building solar farms and you don't have much energy storage, then you end up with an oversupply of daytime electricity. So around the middle of the day, you're going to have lots of electricity going into the system, and the spot price, the wholesale price of electricity around the middle of the day is going to be very low. So that means that if you are selling electricity in the middle of the day, then you're going to get poor revenue, poor profits. So that's going to reduce the profitability of existing solar farms and new solar farms. Same sort of thing for wind. If at windy times the price is going to be low. So if you don't have energy storage, it's going to delay the transition even more. Energy storage also, if we look into the future to like a high renewable system where you've got, say, 90% or 100% of the energy is supplied from wind and solar, then you do need really good coordination of the energy storages. If you consider a cloudy still week, like a wind drought, as they call it, you're going to get high prices for the spot market of electricity. The companies that own the energy storage, they're going to see a big profit opportunity in discharging their storage and supplying energy into the market. So they'll do that. They'll make good money. But we've still got still wind conditions and cloudy, so the storages won't have an opportunity to recharge. There won't be excess energy available for them, which means that if you have another period a bit later in the week when you need those storages to discharge, bad luck. They haven't they don't have any energy stored up, and they won't be able to supply, and you could have a blackout. So the way to avoid that is by better coordination and directing some of those energy storages to not discharge early in the week and conserve that energy for the potential time later on when you really need it. But in the current market, there's not really a way to do this, unfortunately. In the current market, it's really assumes that acting on that spot price is going to lead to a reliable system, which in the case of a high renewable grid, yeah, that market system isn't really going to be sufficient. All right, quick note on Snowy Hydro 2.0. So this is the big project which is pretty much underway in the Snowy Mountains, and it's connecting two existing dams, so you don't need any new dams. The power that it can generate is about the same as a big coal-fired power station, 2 gigawatts. And this is deep storage, so it can, when the top dam's full, then it can discharge at full power for a whole week. So it can hold 350 gigawatt hours of energy. So that's a very large amount of energy. It's attracted criticism for cost and potential economics and also local environmental issues. But the big attraction of it is that it's much cheaper and more durable than storing energy in batteries. So durability, you're looking at 50 years maybe or more. I mean, we've got hydroelectric schemes running now that were built back in the 1920s and 30s. So that's a great track record there. And in terms of cost, it's interesting to compare it to household batteries, for example, the Tesla Powerwall 2. So if you took every household in Australia, including apartments, and you wanted to install batteries to equal the same energy storage capacity as Snowy Hydro 2, you'd have to put 2.6 Powerwall 2 batteries in each house. And so you're looking at a cost of around $29,000 per household under that option. Or you can get the same amount of energy storage in Snowy Hydro 2, and on the strict project costing estimates, you're looking at around $400 per household. So it's obviously a much cheaper option if you're looking at deep energy storage. So do you need that much deep energy storage? That's one of the questions. Do you need energy that you can run for a whole week? So what you can really do with that is cover those wind droughts. If you have a week or two where it's the sun's really not shining and the wind's really not blowing, then you can eke out that storage. You can open the floodgates from the top dam and put the water through the turbine over an extended period to help cover those couple of weeks. And so it's almost like interseasonal storage. So AEMO has looked at this in their integrated system plan, which is in draft form, by the way. I think I hadn't mentioned that initially. And that they've provided us with this chart showing that, yeah, in their simulation, their simulation system has used Snowy Hydro 2 to its full potential. It is discharging it fully at times and then recharging it. So that shows that it is useful, and AEMO has said that for their rapid transition scenario, it's an essential component of it. All right, here's another little cartoon for you. All right, so I'll give you the answer why these are relevant. So that they date back from when the market was set up in the mid-90s. So yeah, another little reference there. Okay, so I've outlined some of the issues with the current market. The fact that, especially with the transmission and energy storage, the the current economic structure and regulatory system, the market as it's broadly defined, is not incentivizing those things, and it's not enabling them to move ahead swiftly. In fact, at this point, everyone really agrees that the market needs reform. I don't think you'll find a company or a market body that would argue with that. However, what they do argue about is how we can progress, how we can reform the market. Now, there's a project underway by the Energy Security Board, and they're looking at designing new market structures, like a reformed market to operate after 2025. And they're considering lots of options. The sorts of things that would be on the table would be, like in other parts of the world, there are totally different types of electricity markets, by the way. Ours is more of a short-term wholesale electricity market supported by off-market contracts. But there are markets that use day-ahead markets or ahead markets, which getting generators to commit ahead of time to the amounts of energy they'll be putting into the system, like the next day or something like that. But what it isn't including is market governance, which is a bit surprising, because in our view, the governance leaves a bit to be desired. So yeah, all of these blue items around the outside are entities that could be considered to have some influence over the market, or some control or direction of it, I guess. So you've got the coalition of Australian governments, investors, companies, and yes, sort of spaghetti soup of different bodies and regulators and market operators. So yeah, I actually asked the head of the Energy Security Board, who should the public hold to account if the transition goes poorly, leading to blackouts? And the reply was, the entire industry would be accountable. And in some ways, that's a good thing. But when you think about it, if everybody's accountable, then really no one's that accountable, because everyone can point fingers at each other. So the risk there is that if no one is really incentivized to make sure that the overall system is run reliably and well, then they may be tempted to look after their own position and agendas more than the overall system. So yeah, it would probably be good to have a bit more direct accountability in the energy system. Okay, so another thing that's going on is that so we've got all these issues in the electricity market, but we also have governments that are doing things on their own, basically bypassing the mechanisms of the market. So I've mentioned Snowy Hydro 2.0 already. So that's a federal government initiative. The federal government now owns the entire Snowy Hydro business. And then we've got state governments doing lots of different things. So I won't go through them, but in some cases they're explicitly doing it to avoid the red tape and the issues with the market as it exists, and just trying to get things done more quickly. So in our view, yes, we're very concerned that the market it's no longer fit for purpose. It is holding up a transition which is in the interest of consumers. If it holds it up too much, then that's going to hurt consumers and may lead to a disorderly transition. You may get these sorts of knee-jerk reactions that I mentioned previously, and that again would be bad for consumers. So we do think that it's probable that you need a more coordinated approach to managing the transition. So, I mean, there's several different ways that you could do that to get a more coordinated approach. But one option would be that AEMO could be empowered to have more control over how the grid evolves and develops. So a bit like what the state-based electricity commissions had. They had the power to actually direct how assets being built in the market. So it would be possible for AEMO to raise tenders to build and construct assets. These would not have to be state-based, state-owned assets like they were in the old days. They could be privately owned assets. And they could be run on tenders on a contract basis as directed by AEMO. So this would be one way that you could get a more coordinated, smoother, quicker way to get the assets into the system, the transmission, the generation, the energy storage that we need if we're going to have a smooth transition to renewables. And then after the transition is complete, then that might be the time for AEMO to step back out again, or whoever the body is that's coordinating this, and reinstate a greater level of competition into the market. And that may be quite a different market that's more suited to a high renewable grid than the one that we have now. I guess an example for this might be public transport. So in many places around Australia, we have public transport that's run by private companies, but they're doing that on a tender contract basis. They're not trying to compete like one train line against another train line or something like that. So there are precedents out there, I guess. So we're going to keep a close watching brief on developments, and we do have a role as a advocate for consumers in the energy market, and we're often involved in consultations, and we're putting in submissions when there are reforms going into the electricity market that relate to consumers. So we'll try and influence things in the interest of our members and consumers in general. So I think that's it from me.
Thank you, Andrew. That was excellent, an exhaustive and widespread analysis of the problem.
Hopefully not exhausting.
No, I don't think exhausting, no. No, everybody's just about stayed on board, so that's great. We do have quite a lot of questions though, so we'll do our best to get through them. We've consolidated a few, so if you don't see your particular one, it's probably in a different form from somebody else. And we'll just work our way down the list. So the first one's from Antonio. Are there any plans for a high voltage version of the DC called HVDC transmission lines? We've been talking about this for 10 years or more.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's an interesting one. There was a study that came out by the Australian National University a few years ago, and they published a plan, I guess, a rough plan based on a simulation that they'd done of how to get a fully renewable electricity grid. That was based on wind and solar and pumped hydro for the energy storage, and a DC transmission backbone, basically on the inland side of the Great Dividing Range, to connect up the states in the NEM. And so, yeah, people certainly have thought about it. With AEMO and their integrated system plan, they haven't included much of a role at this stage for high voltage DC. They've gone for AC power lines, transmission lines, and I think the reason for it is two main reasons. One is that it's more flexible. With a AC alternating current transmission line, you can have lots of little stops along the way, stations, connection stations, where you can take in energy from wind and solar farms, for example. So the transmission line becomes not just a way to transport electricity from one end to the other, like an express train. It also is a way to facilitate whole new areas for wind and solar development. And I guess the other reason is that it's a bit more flexible. Instead of building one massive project at one go, you can sort of do it stage by stage. So if we're talking about a program of works that's extending over maybe a decade, over that time, as you build it out, things may change a bit, and you may want to change direction a little bit. So the AC has a bit more flexibility. But yeah, it's certainly an open issue, and I would think DC that does have a lot of merit for especially long range transmission, like from North Queensland, which has great solar and wind resources, and get that down to the major population centres.
Or probably if we're connecting to Indonesia or Singapore, or maybe even Tasmania.
Yes.
The next question is from a long way away, from Darwin, from Greg. Whatever the primary energy source, are we willing to continue accepting the relatively low reliability and high vulnerability of central generation, which of course requires the major transmission infrastructure and their associated losses?
I guess there's a bit of a premise that's built into that question, that centralized transmission is vulnerable and unreliable. But I guess if you have to compare it with the alternative. If you don't have a transmission system, then it means each city, each major industrial facility has to power itself, like a off the grid standalone system. And that actually becomes quite vulnerable, because it's relying on a limited renewable resource. It's only got access to its own weather system, in effect. So it becomes vulnerable to exposed to localized weeks where it's all cloudy and still without wind. So you need to have a massive energy storage, or you need to find some other way to cover those periods of demand. So basically, every study that's looked into this for the east coast of Australia as a whole, they've all found that yes, transmission is worth it. Transmission is not that expensive when you compare it to other parts of the electricity grid, and it's really useful to be able to share renewable energy from North Queensland to New South Wales down to Tassie, and draw in all those weather patterns that are not so correlated with each other.
Yeah. And from Glenn, there is a proposal for an offshore wind farm near the Latrobe Valley, which doesn't seem to be in your plan. Why not?
Well, first I'd say it's not actually my plan. It's the Australian Energy Market Operators. Yeah, it's a good question. Look, the more wind and solar we get into the system, the better. I think AEMO, with the costings that they had built in for offshore wind compared to onshore wind, they'd found that it was more of that onshore wind was a bit more economic, so their system was choosing that instead. But look, I'm a fan of offshore wind as well as onshore wind. Just if the projects stack up and that they can get the green light, then yeah, the more the better, basically. Oh yes, yeah, so, sorry. Just one other thing. Going back to the previous question, where standalone electricity systems do make a lot of sense is where you've got a small town that's supplied by a thin, vulnerable power line going through the bush, like Malakuta, for example. So there, yeah, it is a lot more cost effective to and avoids those reliability issues of trees falling on power lines, for example. It is more cost effective to supply it as a standalone power system, and lots of the networks are in the process of doing that, converting those isolated communities to off-grid standalone power systems. But if we're talking about cities and aluminium smelters and things like that, then yeah, all the studies show that transmission is a better way to go.
And Jan says, what is the basis for your assertion that coal-fired power stations are cheaper to build than renewable installations?
Oh, just the studies that the CSIRO did with AEMO. So in terms of the upfront cost to build it, to provide the same amount of energy, because you have to consider that if you have a wind farm or a solar farm with a rated capacity of 1 gigawatt, and you have a coal-fired power station with a rated capacity of 1 gigawatt, they're not going to provide the same amount of energy over a year. The coal-fired power station, sure, it'll have some shutdowns for maintenance, etc., but over a year it can generate a lot more energy than what a wind farm or a solar farm. It might generate, say, 35 or 40% of the energy compared to if it was running flat out at its rated capacity for a whole year. So you do need to build more capacity with the renewables. Yeah, and once you take that into account, then the upfront cost is higher. But of course the running costs are much lower. So overall, it's more economic.
Peter says, talking about renewable generation technologies, what's happened to things like solar thermal, and why did the investment in South Australia fail?
Yeah, that's the Aurora project in Port Augusta. Yeah, it had trouble finding committed investment. So yeah, the project didn't get up. One of the main problems is, so that's solar thermal. So you've got a vast field of mirrors that are all focusing sunlight up to a tower in the middle, superheating a fluid that then drives turbines, etc. And also that liquid can be stored in tanks for energy storage. So one of the benefits of that system is that it has energy storage built in, but on the other hand, as I explained in the webinar, energy storage is relatively expensive, and it's not really rewarded by the market. So if you've got a renewable system that includes energy storage, that is great, and it's important, but the current market doesn't really incentivize it or value it. So it's hard to get those projects up. Also, I did do a back of the envelope analysis of the Aurora project compared to equivalent mix of the Bungala solar farm, which is going ahead, and that's in the same vicinity, and also the Coltana pumped hydro facility, which is also not too far from Port Augusta. And so that's seawater pumped hydro on Department of Defence land, which is at this stage is not going ahead. But both of those had costs published for them. So if you compare the amount of energy generation and energy storage that you got out of Aurora compared to the prorated storage and generation you get from the solar farm and the pumped hydro, yeah, the solar and the pumped hydro actually came out cheaper. So at this stage on projects that have been proposed or going ahead, it looks like you're better off to go with solar PV and pumped hydro rather than solar thermal. So maybe that'll change in the future as we get more learnings and experience from solar thermal overseas, but yeah, it's hard to get it up at the moment in Australia.
Which nicely brings me on to the next question, which is, have you looked at decentralized pump hydro? I think that's rather than Snowy. For example, the 250 megawatt Kidston pump storage hydro project.
Yep. So those are smaller pumped hydros, and they're not so much deep storage. They're more shallower storage. So when the top dam's full and they're discharging at full power, then they'll maybe last for a few hours or a day maximum, compared to like a week for Snowy hydro. They've had a bit of trouble getting up and running. I think Kidston now has had some backing from a government perhaps, and that's helping it to go ahead. And yeah, smaller pumped hydros, they're great as well. Look, we need a lot of energy storage. So with those numbers that I had from AEMO, we need a power level of about 20 gigawatts of energy storage. Snowy Hydro 2.0 is only 2 gigawatts. So there's another 18 that we need for a 90% renewable grid. And yeah, that could come from a smaller pumped hydro. It could come from batteries. It could come from hydrogen. It's just a matter of which projects have the most merit and can attract backing, I guess. Yeah.
And from John, do the percentage of wind, solar and other renewables apply only to Australia, or is it to most countries? And is it a standard formula, or is it based on geographic and demographic models?
It's going to be different for different countries. Yeah. So everything that I'm presenting is really focused on Australia. I haven't looked at other countries in that much detail. And yeah, if you take Germany, for example, if you look at their solar panels that are optimally oriented, in their case towards the south, and how much that would generate, it's equivalent to a solar panel in Australia that's very poorly oriented south. So you've got solar resources in Germany are a lot worse than what they are in Australia, for example. So each country is going to be different. Also, a lot of other countries have better connection to their neighbours than what Australia does, which at the moment is 0, unless you count Tasmania a neighbour, rather than part of Australia, which it is. But anyway, so yeah, different countries have different situations, and when the renewable resources are really poor, then there may even be an argument for nuclear in some countries that have an existing nuclear industry. But yeah, that's a topic for another presentation, I guess.
Could the complications, this is from Eve, and built-in administrative difficulties in getting a new upgraded transmission system to enable renewable growths to be a strategy be deliberately delayed by the fossil fuel operators and supporters, just delaying the replacement of the renewables?
Yes, it could be. I mean, we live in a capitalist society, and yeah, that's in the society in which we live in. Companies do talk their books, and they promote their own interests, and they have an obligation to do that for their shareholders. So yeah, you would expect that there's a lot of lobbying going on, and there certainly is. And with this massive amount of investment that needs to happen one way or another, then yeah, it's a big opportunity for investors of different projects and different companies to get a look in. But beyond that, I don't really want to get into the real politics of it.
Fair enough. And from Chris, what about the FCAS revenue for batteries? Isn't Tesla big battery very profitable?
Yeah, that's right. Yep. So FCAS is Frequency Control Ancillary Services, one of those acronyms. There's so many in this industry. So what that is acting like a shock absorber in the electricity system. So if something goes wrong, if a power station breaks down somewhere, and you have a sudden disturbance in the system, a sudden shock, then that can cause the frequency of the electricity in the grid. So it's going at 50 cycles per second normally, but if a big generator suddenly drops out, then that frequency is going to slow down. It's like if you're riding a bicycle and then suddenly you start going uphill, then you're going to start pedaling a bit slower, and you need something to kick in to give a quick push to get everything moving a bit faster and boost up that frequency again. So we're talking millisecond, very short duration response, and AEMO, on behalf of all consumers, pays companies to provide that quick push, that quick injection of energy into the system, and that's a separate payment stream than what's in the normal energy market. And yes, the Tesla Big Battery's been very successful in supplying that market and making money from it, which is great. So that Tesla Big Battery, it's done really well. It has helped to keep the electricity supply more stable, and it's been able to do that more precisely and more efficiently than their competitors in that market, which is mostly gas-fired power stations. So that's a great thing, but it's a fairly limited market. It's you don't need that many batteries and things to act as that shock absorber. So it's already almost saturated, that market, and you don't need many more batteries to do that. Okay, well, you need some more, but it's a much smaller scale of what we're talking about. So Tesla Big Battery, it's being upgraded at the moment. It's going to get up to 200 megawatt hours of energy storage. That's 0.2 gigawatt hours. So 0.2 compared to Snowy Hydro, which is 350 gigawatt hours. So we're talking like, in order to equal the energy capacity of Snowy Hydro 2, you'd need something like 1,700 Tesla Big Batteries. And that's the level of energy storage that we need when we're talking about firming up wind and solar, in terms of storing energy from the times at the start of the week when it's windy and sunny, and saving it up for the end of the week when it's cloudy and still for a whole state. Yeah, so yep, the Tesla Big Battery's done well, but it's been playing in a different market than what we need to really firm up gigawatts of wind and solar.
Just adding to your answer, I don't know if anybody has followed the AEMO reports. They do a quarterly report I'd recommend people look at. But in the first quarter of this year, the 3 batteries in South Australia earned $50 million on FCAS charges alone. So they had an extremely profitable quarter.
It was a bit of an exceptional quarter because there were some big
events. The connector fell out, yeah.
Yeah.
But that's happened twice recently.
Yep.
From John, why are legacy generators that are increasingly unreliable now not required to build in firming?
Well, I guess the short answer is because the market doesn't require anybody to build in firming, which is one of the problems, as I outlined in the webinar. So requiring individual generators to provide their own firming is one possibility, I guess, but it's not necessarily the best way to go, because what we need is firming, like energy storage, for the for the entire system. The entire system needs to be reliable. We don't necessarily need each generator to be reliable. If I go back to my analogy with the housing developments, do you require every housing developer to build a train station in their new development? Well, no, you don't, because maybe a better answer is you can build a train station in between two housing developments, and it serves both of them, and that might be a more efficient way to do it. And it's the same with the energy storage for firming, I guess. You have locations like Snowy Hydro 2 or down in Tassie. They've got pumped hydro locations, or Kidston, as someone mentioned, an old mine that's no longer used anymore, that has this massive hole that you can use for storing water in. Two massive holes, actually. One's higher than the other. That's what you need. So you do want to take advantage of those special locations and those special opportunities for energy storage. If you required it of every generator, then you're forcing people to build the energy storage where you're also harvesting wind or sun. So you're either going to compromise perhaps on the good location for the energy storage, or you're going to compromise on the location for the good solar and wind resource. So yeah, it's probably not the best idea to force individual generators to provide their own firming, I would suggest.
Can I extend the question? Isn't that required for the new wind generators? Aren't they trying to put pressure on them to firm up?
Well, they're not directly. Nobody's forcing them to put batteries or something on their own, co-located with their own turbines. There are some regulatory measures that have come in. I probably won't go into them now, but there have been some changes in the market, I guess, to that are forcing. It's actually more put on the big electricity retailers like AGL, Origin, Energy Australia, those guys. They're forcing them to purchase contracts from dispatchable generators, like firmed generators, but really it's quite an indirect mechanism, and it's hard to have confidence that that's going to solve the issue that we need, which is actual assets on the ground to have a reliable power system.
Good. Another question from Chris. To address the still overcast weather problem, isn't the diversity of energy generation across the eastern seaboard reducing the risk of this happening in the long term?
I thought I would get this question, and I actually have a slide up my sleeve to talk about this. Yes, here we go. Yeah, so this is a chart with lots of lines on it. I apologize for that. But what it is, 2nd of January 2020, from midnight to midnight, and each of those lines is a wind farm in the NEM, the eastern states of Australia. So the key thing is, if you look around midday, 12 o'clock, all the wind farms are down, operating at around 10 to less than 14% of their capacity. Apart from one in Tassie, which is that pink one that I've highlighted there. So unfortunately, with the wind farms that we currently have, and this includes some up in Queensland and lots in South Australia, lots in Victoria, some in New South Wales. So unfortunately, the wind farms that we have across those states, we don't always have diversity. There are times when they're all affected by low wind all at once, and they're not generating very much. So diversity, yes, it helps, but not all the time. And we we can't design a system for what happens most of the time. We have to design a system that's going to cover, you know, all those events, all those nasty events. So I'm really hanging out to see some studies on, well, what if we put the wind farms in slightly different locations, perhaps. So at the moment, the developers have an incentive to generate as much as they can, basically. So they're they're putting the wind turbines in the locations that generate the most energy total over a whole year. There's not much incentive for them to maybe choose a different location that generates a little bit less over the whole year, but generates more at times when the other wind farms are suffering from low wind. So yeah, it would be good to see some studies on could the diversity be improved by different locations of wind turbines, and also perhaps by different designs of wind turbines. We hear of newer designs of wind turbines that sacrifice a bit of raw power for being able to harvest the lower wind speeds better. So they generate a bit more at the times when you really need it, when the rest of the wind turbines are suffering. So hopefully that will improve a bit, but at the moment it's not looking great. Diversity doesn't seem to be doing as much as what a lot of people have been hoping.
Well, the beauty is that it's middle of the day, so solar is contracyclical to a large degree.
Yeah, that's right for that event, but I think you'll find there are other times when it happens at 8 o'clock at night or something. So, yeah.
From Eve, why is there so little focused discussion and community education about electricity conservation, including for business and industry as well as households?
So, what was
this is energy efficiency. Why is there little action on that front?
Why is there little action? Okay. Well, at Renew, that's a big focus for us, actually, energy efficiency, especially at the moment on housing standards. So if new houses that are built now have to be built to a minimum 6-star energy rating. So that's a measure of how much energy they need for heating and cooling in a year. And we've got a significant effort into advocacy for increasing that standard to, say, 7 or 7.5 stars for new buildings, and also measures on existing buildings as well to have them retrofitted for more efficiency. So draft ceiling, insulation, all of those things. So that's an example, I guess. But yeah, we often are talking, and we've got a series of webinars for specific clients and councils and groups where we are talking about how to keep your home warm in winter. In fact, I've got one of those coming up tomorrow night for a local council. So in our magazines, we talk about that all the time. Just a couple of editions ago of Renew magazine, we had a draft ceiling buyer's guide with incredibly detailed sort of notes on all the products out there that you can use to seal up those drafts in your home. So yes, from Renew's point of view, we do have a lot of focus on that, and we do talk about it a lot, and it's a really important issue because the less energy you use, then the less solar panels and wind turbines and batteries and things that you have to build. So that means you can transition faster. You don't have as much embodied energy in the gear that you have to install, and all the issues that go along with that. So yeah, it's a big issue, and especially in Victoria, heating buildings heating buildings in Victoria uses a large amount of energy, because we tend to have in Victoria a lot of homes have whole house ducted gas heating systems, which are quite inefficient. So the amount of energy that goes through those is quite staggering, and that's maybe one of the biggest challenges to transitioning to a fully renewable energy supply in total, and not just electricity, but across the economy, is supplying Melbourne, is heating Melbourne homes, keeping people warm in Melbourne in winter when there isn't that much sunshine around.
Good. We've got quite a few more questions, but which look good. Are you all right to keep going?
Yeah, I'll keep going, sure.
Yeah, from John, has the ISP run a simulation on car batteries feeding in and out of the grid? Car batteries have 30 to 100 kilowatt hours of storage.
Yeah, they haven't got into that yet with AEMO. They've got that on their list of things to look at soon. So I'm trying to think whether they're going to look at that for the final version of the ISP for 2020. Maybe not, but I agree that that's a massive opportunity. So vehicle to home and vehicle to grid is the term, the acronym, V to H, V to G. So you've got to, assuming we get a big uptake of electric vehicles, which does look like it's likely to happen in a few years once we approach the parity in price between a petrol car and an electric car, then we're going to have lots of electric cars that spend 90% of their time parked somewhere, either in someone's garage or carport, or in a car park at work, or a car park in a shopping centre. And those are all opportunities for that car to be plugged in, and well, obviously it can charge the car, but there's also the opportunity to take some electricity out of the car's battery when it's needed by the grid, and when the car owner has agreed to allow that. So supporting the electricity grid by discharging from car batteries, and I think that is going to become a big opportunity, and AEMO is aware of that, but I don't think they've just done that work to build it in yet. And the other thing that needs to happen there is the charging standards. The electric vehicle charger standards need to support it, and the main standard, they're apparently they're looking at 2024 to have that negotiated and set up with all the electric cars and the chargers to allow that to happen. So yeah, I do think it's going to be a big opportunity. Probably a lot bigger than the solar battery. So if you have a solar system at home and you add a battery on, then that can do the same thing. But yeah, a solar battery, you may be looking at around 10 kilowatt hours of energy. And as I think you said, like a car battery could be, say, 60 kilowatt hours. So the car batteries are a lot bigger, and they're probably a more compelling. They've got better economics at the moment, because home solar batteries, for most people, the economics are not there yet. So yeah, I agree, that could be a big opportunity.
From Keith, could local generation storage distribution be part of the mix? In the 1950s, many towns had backup diesel, which were grid connected.
Sorry, were grid connected, or?
Were probably grid connected, or to their local grid connected.
Yeah, certainly. So, well, we in terms of the generation, we already have that. We've got 10 gigawatts of rooftop solar. But I think what you're talking about is more of a microgrid sort of concept, where you have a suburb, for example, or a town, which it is connected to the grid, but it also has the ability to island itself from the grid if necessary. So let's say you had a statewide blackout, then maybe a country town could keep itself running. Yeah, that's a good idea, and there have been some trials in that direction. You're looking at inverters that can grid forming inverters is a term that they use to that can keep the town running, sort of thing. Um, one of the issues in Australia is again coming back to the regulations and the way everything's organised. I guess ownership of the grid is quite firmly entrenched in the hands of your local electricity distributor, and there's 13 of them around the NEM, and plus others in WA and NT and all that. So anything that's going to happen, it really has to go through the local owner of the poles and wires, and they're doing trials on this sort of thing. For example, there was one done in Bark, which is a Melbourne suburb, by AusNet Services, and so they've proved that it can be done if you have the right inverters and batteries on houses, then they can cooperate to power a street. That's what they proved at this stage. So yeah, it's possible, but I think it's a concept that's a bit slow to develop in this country.
And from Colin, we have Ross Garneau's latest 800% renewable energy. He doesn't believe this has been included in any vision for our renewable generating capacity and the heavy demand required, and perhaps flexible, I'll add, for steel and aluminium refining.
Yeah.
So that needs a complete rethink of the total market.
This was one of the areas that I purposely didn't get into in the interest of time, because it has been covered on a previous session by previous talks by Ross Garneau and also by the professor from the ANU a couple of months ago. His webinar went through this as well. So I'd recommend looking at that. But yeah, those things should definitely happen. We export a lot of energy in the forms of fossil fuel and uranium, and we also export a lot of semi-finished or raw materials like iron ore and those sorts of things, where other countries overseas have to expend a lot of energy to refine them into a usable product. So it would make, in a sensible world, it just makes enormous sense to use renewable energy in Australia, where we have such high quality renewable resources, to refine those raw materials into the finished products here, and therefore save so much energy in refining overseas, which is generally more dirty energy sources, and also in the energy to transport the less bulky product. So yeah, and so if we can get traction on that, then we're talking about, yeah, as you said, like 8 times the electricity that we need just to supply our local grid. Now, one of the questions is whether those industrial facilities to do that processing, are they going to be connected to our local grid, our NEM, or are they going to be separate off-grid locations? So, for example, producing ammonia, we already produce a lot of ammonia over in Western Australia in the Pilbara from fossil fuels, and there are some trials underway to produce ammonia there from wind and solar instead. And so if that was the case, the Pilbara has no electricity connection to Perth, let alone the East Coast. So that would definitely be a separate project, not without impact on the main electricity grid. If you have those sorts of projects located with the main electricity grid, then yes, they have the potential to be flexible. So when you have a period of cloudy, still weather, then maybe those sites back off a bit, so they're not consuming so much electricity from the grid. So that gives a smoother demand profile, which is well, smoother. You can look at it both ways from a supply and demand point of view, but that can help with the reliability, yeah. But what we want to be careful of is companies that are building these projects saying that they're renewable, but actually not building their own wind and solar to cover their demand. So yeah, I'm a fan of those things. We just have to make sure that they're done well. And if they are done well, then it would definitely help the local grid. Yeah.
Okay, it all has to be planned, and if you're making 8 times as much, then you need much less storage, I would argue.
Yeah, if you do it well, that's right. You wouldn't need as much storage. Yeah, but
Probably have maybe 3 or 4 more questions. Call it a day.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
So, Michael, how can TUOS and MLF be avoided for local generation and consumption?
Okay, so for the benefit of everyone else, so TUOS is transmission use of service. It's a way that big consumers pay for their and generators pay for their use of the transmission system, and MLF is marginal loss factor. So that's something that I alluded to in one of my slides, where we've found that wind and solar farms, so let's say you're in a area that's on the edge of the grid and you don't have a very strong transmission line back to the main population centres, then if you generate 1 megawatt hour of energy at your site and you put it into the transmission line, because you have losses in the line, by the time it gets to the major population centres, it's not 1 megawatt hour anymore. It's only, say, 0.95 megawatt hours. So with the regulatory system as it's set up now in the market system, the generator only gets credited for 95% of its generation. Even though it put in 1 megawatt hour, it's only getting paid for 0.95, and that's the marginal loss factor, the MLF. If you get a whole bunch of generators next door to you popping up and also generating into that same transmission line, then the losses in the line get worse. So now you have congestion in the line. So now when you put in 1 megawatt hour, what comes out in the population centre might only be 0.9. So the marginal loss factor is worse, and you're only getting paid for 0.9 of what you generate rather than 0.95. So that's what marginal loss factor is, and that's one of the problems that the wind and solar farms and investors have been hit with. Sorry, can you remind me what the question was?
I think you've answered that question pretty well.
Well, I've answered what it is, but the question was about how do we avoid it for local generation?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, so local generation. If you take an example, there was a case of a university that had 2 buildings on opposite sides of a road, and that they had a big solar system on one building and no solar system on the other. And so they were saying, well, we're exporting electricity in the middle of the day anyway. We're exporting on this side and we're importing on this side. Can't you let us cancel these 2 bills out so we don't have to pay anything, rather than exporting and getting paid, say, 10 cents per kilowatt hour, and then importing on the other side for, say, 25 cents per kilowatt hour, if we're importing the same as we're exporting, why don't we just call it quits and say we don't need to pay anything? Because a large part of that 25 cents that they're paying over here is paying for use of the network. And really, the only part of the network they're using is just the poles and wires to get it from one side of the street to the other. So they're saying, well, it's not fair that we're paying for the full cost of the network when we're only using this much of the network. So that's where the local generation argument comes in. And there have been rule changes submitted to the Australian Energy Market Commission to try and make allowance for these sorts of situations, but they basically rejected it. So at the moment, we have no progress on that one. Yeah, it is a tricky issue because if everybody starts doing that, then no one's going to pay for the network, and then potentially it falls into disrepair, I guess. And we actually do need a distribution network, especially for things like traffic lights and hospitals and all those other things. So yeah, it would be good to have some allowance for that, especially in clear-cut cases, but we don't yet, and it's not really on the horizon.
I know it's tricky. I'm working on a local council project, and we have 2 adjoining pieces of council land on different titles, and they still want to charge us the distribution cost because we're going across a title boundary. Yeah,
it's quite inflexible at the moment.
Yeah. Matthew asks, what is the relative merit of more geographic diversity, e.g. Northern Territory and WA versus storage?
Northern Territory and WA is tricky. That's quite a long transmission line to build. There's just been news out in the last couple of days that the Queensland government is putting in some funds to extend a transmission line to Mount Isa in the sort of northwest of Queensland. So that's starting to get towards the Northern Territory. So then if you could extend that to Tennant Creek, then you can combine NT, and then if you extend that further over to WA, then you combine that. But the distances and the costs are really quite high. I think the starting point is just getting a strong line to far north Queensland. So that's something we don't really have yet, and sort of comes back to the high voltage DC that we talked about with one of the first questions, I guess. It may be feasible, but it's there haven't been that many studies into it yet, because it seems, yeah, there's so many other opportunities closer to the main grid. Also, Western Australia and NT are such small energy consumers compared to the East State. It would be more of a one-way sort of assistance. There wouldn't be so much value going the other way.
And from Peter, the Star of the South is an excellent wind source. Is the good connectivity worth the extra cost? And I might include the following question from it, which is, what's the impact of the Marinus link from Tasmania, which will be, they plan to produce 200% renewable energy? And I combine those because I think once they land, they're actually the same link from southeast, from Gippsland up.
Yeah, I wasn't aware if there was a connection between those two projects. Star of the South, so this is the offshore wind farm that someone else mentioned. I don't know much detail about that project, to be honest. As I said, I'm in favour of lots of wind and solar. We need it not just for our current electricity grid, but also for decarbonising transport with electric vehicles, etc., and for electrifying our building heating and exporting energy and refining metals and all those things. So really, yeah, the more projects that can get up, the better, in my view. I've heard that Star of the South has a very good capacity factor. So that means the proportion of energy you get compared to if its rated capacity was going 24/7, 365. So that sounds good. But whether the costs, it does cost more to build a offshore wind rather than onshore. Whether that cost is worth it, that's going to depend on local conditions, like, you know, seabeds and all that stuff. And I hope it gets up. It'll be great, but I don't really know. In terms of Marinus Link, now that's a very important one. So at the moment, there's one interconnector from Tassie to Victoria, and that is a DC connection, by the way. That's an example of one that does exist in the grid. It's not as high voltage as the voltage isn't as high as this is some of the newer technology that's come out, but yeah, it's a connection. Marinus Link is to build another connection, in fact, double connection at a different location on the coast, which provides some redundancy. So if one fails, breaks, that would never happen, would it? Yes, it has happened. then you've got a backup. And also to just provide a lot more capacity to send renewable energy from Tassie to Victoria, which makes a lot of sense because there's a great wind resource down there. It's already firmed. This is one of the locations where firming is not an issue because you've got this massive hydroelectric system down in Tassie. So if the wind stops blowing, then you just turn the taps up on your hydroelectric a bit more. When the wind is blowing, then you turn off the taps on your hydroelectric and you conserve that water in the high dams, and you've got ready-made energy storage. So that's great. So Marinus Link is really important in my view. And AEMO has said that for their rapid transition scenario, it's necessary. Yeah.
On the Star of the Sea, that's a political one, as you probably well know, which is because it's in Commonwealth territory.
Yes.
Once you're off land, you're not in a state, you're in Commonwealth. And our lovely Minister of Energy and Environment refuses to change the rules to look at Commonwealth territories. So he is at the moment not permitting anybody to review offshore wind.
Right, okay.
But hopefully that will change.
Yeah, I wasn't up with the latest on that, but that doesn't sound surprising. Yeah.
And my last question is from Joe. Excellent presentation. I live in a regional agricultural region. We consume 2.8 gigawatts of electricity for irrigation. We found that 4 megawatt wind turbines, solar or small scale pumped hydro was not financially viable without 50% grant funding. We also found that the retail license issue in Victoria was a high hurdle to jump if you wanted to reduce energy costs or achieve better energy security. Do you have a solution?
2 gigawatts. If that's an actual power value, then that's enormous. I guess maybe talking about gigawatt hours over a time period.
That's presumably over a year.
Yeah, presumably. Yeah. Still a large sort of proposition. Retail licenses, yeah.
Jump in a second. They use 2 million litres of diesel a year.
Yeah, that's a lot. In general, if you're replacing diesel, then wind and solar, and well, solar mostly on the smaller scale, but for what you're talking about, perhaps wind is very economic. And if it's water pumping, then you may not need that much batteries in the mix as well, because if it's an irrigation situation where you can just pump during the day, then you don't need so much battery to see you through the night. So I'm surprised that you had trouble with the economics to get that up, to be honest. Retailer licenses, yeah, that's very expensive, but I don't see why you would need one. It's quite a specific question, so I don't know if we can get to the bottom of it in this format.
Right. Well, you've done a great job there, Andrew.
Oh, thanks, Robin.
I always find this area a little bit difficult because normally we'd be thanking you and having lots of claps and you get a bottle of wine and things, but
thanks, guys. It was a pleasure.
good. And thank you, everybody. Thank you for Doug for organising all this, and thank you very much to Andrew. We'll be having another session next month, same, or 4 weeks' time, same time. And we'll send out notes on that. And Renew also has a meeting just about every week from one of the branches around the country. Thank you.
Thanks.